The last two videos on this channel showed you a brewer and an automaker absorbing the cost of Trump's own tariffs. This one is different because this time the fight over who pays isn't just Canada versus Washington. It's Americans versus other Americans in public, on the record, over a single 2x4. The National Association of Home Builders says combined tariffs have added somewhere between $7,500 and $10,000 to the cost of an average new single-family home in America. A rival American industry group says that number is essentially propaganda, and that lumber makes up less than 2% of what a house actually costs to build. Both of those groups are American. Both of them are citing real data, and they cannot both be right. If you've been watching this channel's coverage of the steelworkers' letter or the aluminum tariffs cost to Molson Coors and GM, you already know Americans keep showing up as the ones absorbing this trade war's bills. What you haven't seen yet is Americans fighting each other over exactly how big that bill actually is. Subscribe before we get into it, because by the end of this, you'll know which side has the stronger case, and why the answer matters more than almost any other tariff fight on this channel right now. And drop a comment when you're done. When two American industries can't agree on whether a tariff is even hurting anyone, who do you actually believe? Let's get into it. Start with the raw mechanics, because this is one of the more complicated tariff stacks this channel has covered. Canada supplies roughly 85% of all softwood lumber imported into the United States, the wood that frames the vast majority of American houses. In 2025, the U.S. Commerce Department more than doubled its countervailing duty on Canadian lumber, from 6.74% to 14.63% following an annual review, and separately nearly tripled the anti-dumping duty from 7.66% to 20.56%. Combined, those two duties alone jumped from roughly 14.5% to 35%. The anti-dumping increase took effect July 29, 2025. The countervailing increase followed on August 12th. Then, in October 2025, a separate 10% Section 232 tariff landed on top of both of those, under the same Trade Expansion Act authority already covering steel and aluminum. Stack all three together, and the effective tariff burden on Canadian softwood lumber hit roughly 45%, a genuinely brutal number for a product this essential to something as basic as a house frame. The National Association of Home Builders didn't stay quiet about it. In forecasts released this year, NAHB estimated that combined tariffs on lumber and other building materials would add between $7,500 and $10,000 to the cost of the average new single-family home. NAHB Chairman Buddy Hughes put it plainly, quote, "These new tariffs will create additional headwinds for an already challenged housing market by further raising construction and renovation costs." End quote. That's not a fringe complaint. NAHB's own April Builder Confidence Survey found 70% of member respondents reporting real difficulty pricing new homes because of ongoing material cost volatility. 7 out of 10 builders unable to confidently tell a customer what a house will actually cost by the time it's framed, permitted, and finished. Here's where the story could have stayed simple. A straightforward tariff hurts American consumers piece, like the last two videos on this channel. Instead, in 2026, something happened that this channel hasn't had to cover yet in this trade war. A second, entirely American industry group stood up and said NAHB has the story backwards. The U.S. Lumber Coalition, representing domestic softwood lumber producers and forestry workers, has spent this year directly and repeatedly attacking NAHB's numbers in public. Steve Swanson, CEO of the Swanson Group and chairman of the coalition, and Zoltan van Heyningen, the coalition's executive director, have both gone on record disputing not just the size of the tariff's impact, but whether it's meaningfully hurting homebuyers at all. Their core statistic, lumber represents less than 2% of the average cost of an American house. If that number is accurate, a 45% tariff on an input that's already a small slice of total cost lands very differently than NAHB's $10,000 figure implies, more like a rounding error passed through a very long supply chain than a crisis reshaping the housing market. The coalition's argument goes further than just disputing NAHB's math. Van Heyningen has said publicly that, quote, Canada unloads its excess capacity into the U.S. market and expects the United States to continue playing the major role, end quote. And separately that, quote, trade law enforcement and Section 232 tariffs will further increase domestic production, solidifying U.S. supply chains, end quote. The numbers behind that argument are real and worth stating plainly. Domestic American producers already supply more than 70% of the lumber used in U.S. housing, and Canada's own softwood lumber industry produces roughly 27 billion board feet of capacity a year against domestic Canadian consumption of only about 6.9 billion board feet, meaning Canada is structurally built to export several times more lumber than it could ever use itself, tariff or no tariff. That capacity gap is also the coalition's justification for the countervailing duty specifically, the piece of this tariff stack that exists to offset foreign government subsidies, not just tax imports generally. The coalition has publicly claimed Canada increased subsidies to its lumber sector by nearly 2 billion Canadian dollars since August 2025, with the capacity to provide as much as 9 billion Canadian dollars in aid if needed. A countervailing duty is specifically designed to cancel out exactly that kind of government support, on the legal theory that a subsidized foreign producer can undercut an unsubsidized domestic one on price. Whether Canada's subsidy levels actually justify a rate this high is a genuinely disputed question, not one this channel is going to settle for you. But the argument itself is a real legally grounded position, not just a talking point invented to justify a tariff that already existed. This fight has moved from press releases into actual legislation, which is worth knowing about because it's still live. NAHB has thrown its support behind Senate Bill 3943, introduced by Senators Coons and Rosen, aimed at providing relief from these lumber duties. The U.S. Lumber Coalition has opposed it just as publicly, with Swanson stating flatly that, quote, S3943 would do nothing to address housing affordability while harming U.S. softwood lumber producers and forestry workers, end quote. That's an actual bill, with actual sponsors sitting in Congress right now, with two organized American industries lobbying in opposite directions over it. This isn't a hypothetical disagreement. It's a real legislative fight with a real vote somewhere on the other side of it. Here's a detail that makes the timing of all of this even more pointed. Commerce's own scheduled 2026 review has signaled it may lower the underlying anti-dumping and countervailing duty rate from around 35% down to roughly 24.83%, a real meaningful cut to that specific piece of the stack if it actually goes through. But that's not the whole bill, and this is the part worth watching closely rather than assuming. The 10% Section 232 tariff isn't part of this review at all. It's a separate authority, and nothing in this signaled change touches it. Add that fixed 10% back on top of the new 24.83% rate, and the effective combined burden lands around 34.83%, a genuine improvement from roughly 45% today, but worth noticing that it settles almost exactly where the underlying anti-dumping and countervailing rate sat on its own, before this year's escalation, just with a permanent Section 232 layer now baked in underneath it that wasn't there before. A real rate cut is still a real rate cut. It's also worth watching whether headlines report the 24.83% number on its own without the fixed 10% still sitting on top of it, the exact kind of incomplete number trap this channel has already caught once this year in a completely different sector. The actual final results of that review, the seventh administrative review in this long-running dispute, are expected sometime in August 2026, or October if the process gets fully extended, meaning this specific number could land or could be delayed. Inside the exact window, this channel has already been tracking toward the August 19th deadline on the broader Section 338 tariffs. Two separate countdown clocks on two separate tariff mechanisms, both converging on roughly the same few weeks. It's worth knowing this isn't a new fight either, which is exactly the kind of historical parallel that's actually earned here rather than reached for. Canada and the United States have been fighting over softwood lumber, in some form, since the early 1980s, through 4 separate rounds of formal disputes, arbitration panels, and negotiated agreements. the most recent of which expired in 2015 without a full renewal. The first round in the early 80s ended with a finding that Canadian stumpage fees, what provincial governments charge logging companies to harvest timber on public land, weren't a subsidy at all. The second and third rounds, running through the late 80s and 90s, produced negotiated quota systems that briefly capped Canadian exports instead of taxing them. The fourth round, launched in 2001, dragged on for 5 years before ending in a 2006 settlement agreement that held for nearly a decade before finally lapsing in 2015. Every one of those rounds followed roughly the same shape. American producers alleging Canadian subsidies, Canadian producers and American buyers alleging the tariffs do more harm than good, a negotiated truce, and eventually a new fight once that truce expired. This isn't this administration inventing a new front in the trade war. It's the fifth act of a fight that's been running on and off for longer than most people watching this video have been alive, and every prior act eventually ended in some form of negotiated settlement, not a permanent tariff wall on either side. On the Canadian side of this fight, the pressure is real too, even if it doesn't show up as cleanly as a single earnings call number, the way it did for the aluminum companies in this channel's last video. Canada's major softwood lumber producers, companies like West Fraser, Canfor, and Interfor, operate the mills that turn that 27 billion board feet of annual capacity into actual lumber. And the industry has spent recent years absorbing a wave of mill curtailments and closures across British Columbia specifically, driven by a mix of reduced timber supply, wildfire damage to harvestable forest, and exactly this kind of tariff pressure stacking on top of already thin margins. That's the other side of the coalition's 27 billion board foot capacity figure worth sitting with. Capacity on paper doesn't automatically mean profitable capacity once a 45% duty is subtracted from the sale price of every board foot that crosses the border. Zoom back out to what this actually means for someone trying to build or buy a house in America right now, because that's the part that gets lost in the trade association back and forth. U.S. framing lumber prices have surged roughly 30% off their recent lows as these duties stacked up. Whether the true added cost to a finished home lands closer to NAHB's $10,000 estimate or the coalition's under 2% framing, both sides agree the underlying commodity price has moved sharply in the same direction up. On a median-priced new home, even the more conservative read of that math is real money added to a mortgage that compounds in interest over 30 years, not a one-time cost that disappears at closing. Run the simple version of that math. $10,000 added to a home price, financed over a 30-year mortgage at a typical current rate, isn't $10,000. It's closer to $20,000 once interest is included, paid a little at a time, for 3 decades, by a buyer who never sees a line item that says tariff anywhere on their closing documents. And this isn't only a new construction story. Hugh's own quote-named renovation costs specifically alongside construction costs, which means the same lumber price spike is sitting inside every deck rebuild, room addition, and storm damage repair happening across the country right now, a quieter, more diffuse cost than a new home price tag, but a real one for millions of existing homeowners who never bought a new house at all. Now bring this back to Canada's actual position in the broader trade war this channel has been tracking. Lumber is one of the 4 sectors, alongside steel, aluminum, and autos, that Canada has explicitly said it wants included in any broader deal on all strategic sectors, not carved out and negotiated separately. Given everything covered here, that makes obvious sense as a negotiating position. Unlike aluminum, where the case against the tariff was close to one-sided, lumber is a fight where a major American industry, backed by actual sitting senators and an actual bill in Congress, is already making Canada's case for it in public against its own government's trade policy. That's the same pattern this channel first documented with the steelworkers' letter to Washington, an American institution pushing back on a tariff aimed at Canada, except this time it isn't uncontested. This time, there's an organized, well-funded American opposition making a real counter-argument, which arguably makes NAHB's continued advocacy more meaningful, not less, because it's not the easy, uncontested position to hold. None of this settles cleanly in either direction, and this channel isn't going to pretend it does. If the coalition's subsidy numbers hold up under scrutiny, the countervailing duty has a real legal foundation, not just a political one. If NAHB's cost estimates hold up instead, American home buyers are paying a meaningful, avoidable premium for a policy sold as protecting American workers. Both of those things can be genuinely true at different scales. A real subsidy problem and a real consumer cost problem layered on top of each other in the same tariff stack, which is exactly the kind of complicated, not fully resolved reality this channel would rather show you than a clean story that isn't actually true. So here's what to watch from here. First, watch the 7th Administrative Review's final results, expected August or October, since that single number determines whether the underlying duty rate actually drops or whether this year's signal turns out to be more talk than relief once the Section 232 layer is added back in. Second, watch Senate Bill 3943 specifically, since a real floor vote in either direction would be the clearest signal yet of which side of this fight actually has more political weight behind it in Washington right now. Third, watch whether lumber gets folded into the broader all strategic sectors deal this channel has already been tracking, or gets left out as too contested to resolve alongside steel, aluminum, and autos. And fourth, watch framing lumber prices themselves over the next month, since a real relief on the duty rate should show up there first, before it ever shows up in a builder's forecast or a Senate committee vote. And a fifth thing worth tracking, specifically because this channel already caught a version of this trick once before. Watch whether any announced rate cut out of the 7th Administrative Review gets reported using only the anti-dumping and countervailing number, without the fixed 10% Section 232 layer added back on top. A drop from 35% to roughly 25% is real progress, but the number that actually lands on an invoice is closer to 35% either way, just built differently underneath. Here's what this actually means for you. If you're building or buying a new home in the United States right now, you're paying into this fight. Whether you've ever heard of the U.S. Lumber Coalition or not, somewhere between an under 2% rounding error and a $10,000 line item, depending on which side of this argument turns out to be closer to right. If you're renting instead of buying, this still touches you indirectly. Higher construction costs on new housing supply feed directly into rent growth in markets, where new building is the main thing keeping rents from climbing faster than they already are. If you work in American forestry or at a domestic sawmill, the story looks completely different. This tariff is the thing standing between your job and a Canadian industry with nearly 4 times more capacity than it can use domestically. And if you're a Canadian lumber producer, you're caught in the middle of an American argument you don't get a vote in, watching 2 different U.S. industries fight over how much your product should cost their own customers, while your own mills absorb curtailments regardless of which American lobby wins this particular round. So here's the actual scoreboard, as honestly as this one can be stated. Unlike the steelworkers' letter or the aluminum industry's cost numbers, this isn't a clean case of Americans quietly absorbing a tariff aimed at Canada with no domestic pushback on the other side. This is a real fight, with real data on both sides, and a real bill sitting in Congress right now. What hasn't changed is the pattern underneath it. For the second time this year, on this channel, an organized American industry is publicly lobbying its own government to go easier on Canada. Not because Canada asked nicely, but because enough American homebuilders decided this tariff costs them more than it's worth. Whether that argument wins this specific fight is still genuinely up in the air. That it's being made this loudly by this many people, backed by an actual bill with actual sponsors, for the second time in one trade war, is the part worth paying attention to, especially since the first time it happened. With the steelworkers, this channel watched that pressure show up in real signed outcomes within months, not years. If you want the version of this story that shows you the real argument instead of picking the convenient side, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe and get that comment in. When 2 American industries can't agree on who's actually getting hurt, does that make the tariff look more justified or less? Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one.